Welcome back to another video tutorial brought to you by thevirtualinstructor.com. Today we're going to be talking about acrylic paint, and we're going to be doing a quick little painting sketch of an apple. And acrylic paint is an interesting medium. It is a painting medium, obviously, and acrylic paint is relatively new in the world. We're talking about maybe the 50s. It's when it first appeared. So acrylics have been around for just a little over 50 years. Acrylics are a water-based medium. That means you use water as the solvent to thin out the paint. Acrylics use an acrylic polymer for the binder, and that makes them more permanent. They kind of almost dry to a plastic finish. And what we're doing right here is a little painting sketch of an apple. And what I'm doing here is I'm creating what's called an underpainting. And an underpainting is just basically what it says. It's a painting that goes under the finished painting. And I'm just blocking in the basic colors of the different areas. And I'm giving a little bit of an indication of value, but not much. Sometimes I'll do an underpainting where it's just about value. But in this case, I'm just kind of blocking in the colors and getting them on. And then from there, I'm going to push the value. And you can see some of the areas are shiny because the acrylics go on wet, obviously. But I've kind of thinned out the acrylics a little bit with some of the water so they flow on a little bit easier. And what I'm doing is just creating layers. So I put a nice underpainting on the background. Now I'm going back over with another layer of the acrylic. And like I said, I'm building up layers of color. And by building up these layers of color, we're going to create some depth in our painting. And a lot of times students will start painting and they'll just put one or two layers, and that's just not enough to get the development and the development of the color that you need for acrylic painting. So all this is just basically underpainting. I've put a little bit of an indication of shadow underneath the apple to give the viewer a little bit of an idea of where the light source is coming from. And I'm going to make the table that this is sitting on just a little bit lighter. So I'm going to go over it with a little bit of yellow and white and just a touch of brown. And then I'm going to go ahead and start adding some of the darker values to the shadowed side of the apple. And just like with oil paint, you can put the paint on and move it around. Just with acrylic paint, you have to work a little bit quicker because it's water-based. It will dry as the water evaporates. So the acrylic paint actually dries very, very quickly. This is to your advantage, and it's also to your disadvantage. It's to your advantage because if you're a quick worker, you're able to put on layers of paint relatively quickly. You don't have to wait for layers to dry a little bit. Where with the oil, you have to wait for the layers to dry a little bit. With acrylic, you can just slap those layers on. Now the drawback to that is you have to work fast. You can't put some color on and decide tomorrow you're going to come back and work it in a little bit. With oil, you have that freedom. So I've put a little bit of the shadowed areas on the apple. They're shining right now, but as they dry, you'll be able to see them get a little bit darker. I'm also adding a little bit more depth to the apple. I'm adding some yellows, and I'm adding these yellows in kind of a wash. So they look really shiny right now, but as it dries, the apple will look like it has a little bit more depth to it. And we're beyond the underpainting stage at this point. We're actually starting to add a little bit more of an indication of form to the apple, to the surrounding areas by building up those values. And if you ask me, value is the most important element of art. So we've got some of the darker values. Now we're adding actually some of the highlights, and I'm just going to drop some of these areas of highlight on the apple, and they're going to seem really strong right now because it is wet and it is a transparent wash. But as that wash dries, it'll become more dull and less intense. So sometimes it's okay to just put the color on and just let it sit, and as it dries into the surface, it will become a little bit more subdued, especially if it's a wash. And what I mean by wash is the paint is thinned out with water, and you can see now this is just a little bit further into the future, and that wash is kind of dried into the surface and just created a pattern, maybe a little bit of texture and depth, and it's not as intense as it was before. Then I'm going to do the same thing I did before, and I'm going to slowly let my paint get a little bit thicker as I work with it. So I'm putting on washes, layers of the washes, and as I work, I'm getting thicker and thicker with the paint. And I'm not just blending everything in either. I'm letting some of the areas of color sit on the surface, like I said, and that's going to make your painting a little bit more interesting to look at, if you ask me. So here I am just pushing the values back and forth, dark, light. And in the process, I'm defining the form of the apple just a little bit more. Now, the surface that I'm working on for this little sketch is called illustration board. And illustration board comes in basically two flavors. You can get cold press illustration board, and you can get hot press illustration board. This is cold press. Cold press gives you a nice tooth to work in, and hot press gives you a smooth surface. You can tell the difference because hot press generally is a little bit shiny, kind of has a waxy coat on the surface, where cold press is more like a sheet of paper that's just backed up with a little bit of board. Now I'm going over the background with a third layer. Like I said, you really need to build up that depth of color by putting different layers and washes on the surface. All the time thinking about your value, continually thinking about the light source, and since this is a sketch, I'm not really going to build up any detail in the background, just color and brush strokes. The brush I'm using for this demonstration is a nylon brush. It's a golden nylon brush. Nylon brushes are synthetic, and they're great with the acrylic paint because acrylic paint is kind of a tougher paint. It's kind of brutal on brushes, and the nylon kind of handles that a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and give a little indication of the stem of the apple. And on the video, it looks like I'm painting it white, but it's actually the shine from the wet paint. Let that dry a little bit and then go back over it with a little bit darker value on the shadowed side of the stem. You may notice my hand keeps going over the top of the apple. That's because my palette is on the other side of the screen, so that's where I'm getting my color from and mixing my color. Now I've let that highlight that I put on a few minutes ago dry a little bit, so I'm going to go back and increase the depth of that highlight with yet another layer of color. This is going to help define the form of the apple a little bit more. And again, it's really strong when you first put it on, but as long as you've got some water mixed in, it'll actually just dull itself back into the apple. So you may be thinking, oh my gosh, that's really bright white. And no, that's okay. It's really not going to be that bright when it dries. Alright, now I'm going to make the shadowed side of the apple just a little bit darker. Again, it's an exercise of pushing your values back and forth. And if you don't believe me, just look around at the world that you're in. Everything has darks and lights and every variation in between. So when you're painting or drawing, you need to make sure that you include the darks and all the different variations in between the darks and the lights. So you need a full range of value, all those tints and shades. Another thing you'll notice is that when I'm making my brush strokes, I'm trying to follow the cross contour lines of the apple. In other words, I'm going in the direction of the form of the apple. That's always a good exercise. Now I'm going to go ahead and make the table a little bit lighter, increase some of the contrast, and make the apple pop a little bit more. The value of the apple is kind of similar to the value of the table. So by making the value of the table a little bit lighter, we make the apple stand out just a little bit more. You'll also notice that even on the table, I'm making my brush strokes follow the cross contours of the surface. You wouldn't want to be making vertical brush strokes here, and I see a lot of students try to make vertical brush strokes here. You need to go in the direction of the object that you're doing. So now we're going to do the same thing that we did with the table in the foreground to the background. I'm going to make the background a little bit lighter to increase the contrast between the apple and the background. That's going to, again, just make the apple pop a little bit more. You'll notice that as I'm adding the value to the background, I am moving my brush around to create kind of a cross hatch pattern in the background. Since we're not putting anything detailed in the background, it would be nice to kind of have a textured pattern in the background, so that's kind of what I'm creating here. That's also going to increase the contrast between the brushstroke pattern on the table and the brushstroke pattern on the apple. So you can increase your contrast not only with value, but with also with pattern and texture. Now in this video I'm just using good old acrylic paint and water. There are a variety of different mediums that you can use with acrylic paint. There are a variety of gel mediums and different retardants that affect drying time, affect the texture and viscosity of the paint as well. I recommend you try out those different mediums and see if they help you with your acrylic painting. So we're going to go ahead and finish this background and make it a little bit lighter. And at this point we have gotten to the point where we've built up our paint enough to create a nice acrylic sketch of an apple. And we'll let that dry, and that'll bring us to the end of this video tutorial brought to you by the virtualinstructor.com. I wish you the best of luck with all your acrylic paintings in the future.